Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another OTD Military History live stream. Today, we are going to be talking about a memoir, just speaking with the guest, our guest today, Mark Aedy, about what it is. And I'm going to let him explain everything because this is a fascinating book. Finally got a chance to get to look at it the last couple of days. My copy that they were generous enough to provide. And it's fascinating. This is a fascinating story that starts in the Second World War and continues through into pretty much into the 1970s and a little bit beyond. So this is going to be an interesting one, spanning two time periods and very much a lot of technological change, particularly within the RAF. So pretty much other than that, welcome my guest today. So thanks for coming on, Mark. I very much appreciated having you on and getting a chance to talk about, well, your dad's book, pretty much.
Well, yeah. Thank you for inviting me, Brad. I'm really pleased to be here.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Like I said, I finally, actually, last couple of days, got a chance to sit down and didn't get through all of it. I'm not going to lie, because it's just a lot of busy lately, but good through a chunk of it. And it's fascinating. I mean, the memoirs always are fascinating to me. I guess I'm, part of the converted, being a historian, but always getting to read the words of those involved. So with that said, I was wondering if you could kind of explain to us how this came about.
Sure. Well, Dad was served for the Royal Air Force in 1942 through to 1973, and was actually operational during the Second World War as an extremely young man. I'm sure we'll touch on that in more detail in a second.
Yeah.
Sadly, having led an incredibly active life up to the age of 49, in 1973, when he was kindly taking me to my first football match, soccer match at Wembley, he sadly had a heart attack on Wembley Underground Tube Station and was ill. And the consequence of that, having been extraordinarily active and very fit and dynamic, he was somewhat beleaguered for the balance of his life. He finally faded away in November 2001, so over 25 years later. And in the late 90s, my rather direct Belgian wife said to my father, and he adored my wife, she asked him to sort of commit to paper what he had done in the war and subsequently in the Royal Air Force, because she sort of understood he'd gone from biplanes through heavy bombers to fast jets.
Right.
And she asked that it be addressed to his my three children.
Right.
And we never heard anything more about it in the late 90s. And literally the day he died, Brad, I was at home with Mum and my sister, and Mum said, "Can you pop up to Dad's office?" And on a hand crank computer, and I'm talking almost like this, 90 pages of close type came out.
Wow.
Covering the time from just before the war up to joining the Royal Air Force in 42, going to Oklahoma to be taught to fly via New Brunswick.
Yep.
And then subsequently the transformation to fast jets, etc. And it's a very personal account. It's warm. I'm biased. I think it's amusing. Sometimes it's pretty harrowing. But I'm very proud about it. And the moment I saw them, I promised I'd publish them. But so it's only taken me 23 years. But here we are, and we launched them. We launched them last night at the Royal Air Force Club in Piccadilly. And I'm very pleased with the outcome. It's a great joy to have actually got to know my father so much better during the process.
Right. And I mean, that's common, I think, for people who do this kind of project is to learn things that you didn't get to learn before. And people don't often like to talk about this stuff. So getting it written down on paper is sometimes easier for people. And of course, that's lucky for us, because then we have the paper to refer to afterwards as well, which is always a fantastic thing. So I was wondering if we could talk, about his motivations to join the RAF specifically. That is something I'm always interested in, particularly in the British case, because as you know, I'm Canadian, and the Canadian case is a little different with things of conscription and stuff like that. So I was wondering if you can just kind of delve into that a little bit for us.
Well, in some ways, Brad, I was quite shocked when I read the first few pages of his memoirs, because one of the things he says early on is how excited he and his friends were to join up. They were highly motivated, and Dad joined the Air Squadron at Southampton University, and he wanted to be a pilot sort of from the get-go. And I think everybody else around him sort of wanted to contribute one way or the other. I must say, my generation, I found it quite difficult to understand the concept of being excited about engaging in war, but they were very motivated. And Dad fell in love with flying very quickly, and that was really the guiding light for the rest of his life. And that courses through the veins of the book. It's not so much a story about the Second World War. It's more a love story about flying and the technological change he witnessed over a 25-year period.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that a little bit at the end, if that's okay, because that's the one thing that obviously stood out to me is loving the love of aviation and flying. I mean, it's hard to miss in that.
Yeah.
So that was, I mean, just again reading the book, but you telling me that, it doesn't surprise me that there is this, I don't know, excitement.
Yes.
I like, again, the vets I knew and the people I knew who lived in that time period, they said just kind of how it was. It's hard to explain.
Whether it would be like that today, Brad, we could probably debate. But then I think, Dad and his peers had a great sense of duty. Also, by the time he joined the Royal Air Force in 1942, the UK had been under threat of invasion for 3 years, and it was going in the wrong direction. So I think there was a pretty well-established idea of motivation about what you needed to do, irrespective of the fact that it was dangerous.
I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, another thing that kind of gets not lost, but in the North American side of things, right, is there's not that necessarily direct, not permanent, but you know what I mean, persistent threat. It doesn't really exist in the works I particularly look at when I'm doing Canadians. But so speaking of North America, because that's the one part of this that not surprised me, but it's just kind of countered most of the stories you hear, because I've done tons of work on the training program here in Canada. Is he went to Oklahoma? How did he? That had to have been a bit of a culture shock to go from World War II era Britain to Oklahoma.
Absolutely right. So in the early stages of the war, you can imagine it was pretty dangerous to be training in the UK. It was obviously very high risk. So there were 3 principal areas where the Royal Air Force went to train, and that was Canada, the United States, and South Africa. And there's an amusing anecdote in the book where Dad says they got issued with pith helmets and shorts. So he said, right, we're off to South Africa. And of course, he was very excited. Anyway, that changed very rapidly. And he found himself on a converted Queen Mary troop ship, the Cunard liner, going across the Atlantic. It lands in New Brunswick. And then he takes 4 days by train via New York to arrive in Ponca City, Oklahoma. And that's sort of in the middle of nowhere. And look, importantly, on arrival in Canada, he talks about suddenly he gets access to fresh food, fresh eggs, and coal and coke in the boilers in the staff rooms. And of course, he arrives in Oklahoma, and it's beautiful weather, blue sky, and endless food and endless kindness that he encountered. He talks about that a lot in Canada and in the United States in the time that he was there. There was one technical problem, was that while he was thrilled to be taught how to fly by bush pilots in Ponca City, there was one problem with Oklahoma in that it was flat. And of course, it goes back to Europe. And as you well know, Europe isn't flat. So he had a pretty rapid learning experience. But he arrived in Ponca City via New Brunswick on the 1st of April, 1943. And he went solo 12 days later in a tiger moth made out of sort of paper and glue. So there we are.
And then that's sort of the story I know, because that's the pretty common part. That's a common aircraft even today. I mean, they're not the best built, but there's tons of them left, so they got to be. There are. Gotta be okay.
They're beautiful.
There's tons of, especially in Canada, right? Because of their training plan. They're kind of all over the place, but still an important aircraft for the war. Because I do want to not just focus on the Second World War, because obviously that's not what the book is just about. But I do have to ask, and again, this is going to be more from your perspective, right? Is because you went through all of this. What's the event, I guess, that stuck out the most to you from your father's experience during the Second World War?
Gosh, I think the overwhelming thing is how young he was. Right. So last night in London, when we celebrated the launch of the memoirs on what was the 29th of May yesterday, he would have been 100 years old. So it actually technically meant he was still 20, despite having been operational as a pilot in Lancasters in 44 and 45. I mean, it's unconscionable. All my children are older than 20. I almost can't conceive of how he managed it. And indeed, his crew were, in some cases, quite a lot older than him. That's the first thing I sort of find overwhelming. The second is, let me just give you a bald statistic. There were 125,000 crew in Bomber Command in the Second World War. 57,000 lost their lives. 8,000 were injured. The only area of any armed service in the Second World War that had a worse attrition rate was the German U-boats. So the casualty rate was terrifying. I mean, effectively 1 and 2. Now, I hasten to add, if my father heard me saying this, he would say, Mark, just remember I caught the end of the war. The air battle was broadly won, and therefore he didn't believe that he took anything like the risk that his colleagues and friends did, and he lost a lot of friends on the way. But I think that combination of extreme youth combined with knowing it was very dangerous, one of his last missions over Potsdam, he gets attacked by an ME-262, which is one of the first operational jets. And his report, which is in the book, he talks about engaging with them at 400 yards and 100 yards. I mean, that seems pretty close to me.
That's very close.
Terrifying. I guess the third thing I'd say is that he was very proud at the very end of the war to drop food supplies to the starving Dutch as part of Operation Manna. And if you're Dutch, that's a famous event. He was very proud about that. And also he helped at the very end of the war, and I'm talking early May 45, in flying back, returning prisoners of war on the Great March back from Poland and Germany, which gave him an awful lot of satisfaction. So, amongst some of the horrific things he was involved in, there were things about which he was immensely proud.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that makes me think of going back to you citing that statistic about the high fatality rate of Bomber Command, which a lot of us are very much aware of. Very knowledgeable audience. Is you don't tend to hear about that because some of the memoirs or the people that are covered in books just don't make it to that point in the war. So it's just not something you get to always get a firsthand look at how it was felt, because I mean it's not surprising from the things I've also read before about Manna, and I mean the one that I don't rarely hear much about is bringing back the POWs. Like I hardly ever get anything to do.
I fear that prompts an amusing story which Dad used to tell rather well. Is that he lands his Lancaster on a former Luftwaffe airfield in northern France in Juvancourt in the Champagne area. And 7-8 Lancasters line up, but it's a grass airfield, so the Lancasters are sinking. So they sort of have to get the POWs, and I say POWs, I'm talking Canadians, Americans, West Indians, etc. They had to get them on board the plane super quick, and the weather was immaculate. It was a beautiful day, and Dad was going to fly them back to Lincolnshire with the rest of his squadron. And he talks about being in front of his Lancaster and a phalanx of POWs sitting cross-legged in front of his aeroplane. And Dad said that they were in a terrible state. I mean, emaciated and unwell and pale and shocking clothes, etc. But in fact, his particular group in front of his Lancaster was being looked after by a Canadian captain, army captain, who himself was a prisoner of war. And Dad And honestly, if you knew my father, I can see him doing it. He was so proud, age 20, looking about 16, standing up and saying, I'm your pilot for today. Flying conditions are perfect. May I thank you for your service. It's a great privilege for me to fly you back. And we're flying to XYZ airfield prior to your transmission home. And as he was speaking, the Canadian Army captain walked up to him and whispered in his ear, and he said, "Look, it's not happening." To which Dad says, "Well, what do you mean it's not happening? The plane is sinking. We need to get going. We've got 10 minutes. Why is it not happening?" And the Canadian captain says, "They think you're too young." So Dad goes, "Well, look, just so you know, I did actually fly the plane here today. I have been operational over Germany. I was taught to fly in Oklahoma in 1943. I have done this before. And by the way, you've got no choice." And the Canadian captain said, "I'm sorry, they've been through too much. They're not risking this last final journey with you." So Dad goes, "Okay." And he walks back with great confidence to the temporary crew room and talks to his engineer, who's 36 and looks 36. And he says, "Alf, I want you to go out in front of those prisoners of war and say with immense confidence, there's been a mistake, that you're the pilot. Get them in the plane and you walk with great confidence into the pilot's seat." To which Alf says, "I can't fly the plane, skipper." And so, "Dad, don't worry about that." So Alf gets them in the plane, sits in the pilot's seat. Yeah. Dad, would you believe, climbs on the tail of the plane, of the Lancaster, over the top and through the hatch and flies them back. How about that?
That's amazing. Oh, that's great. I mean, sorry, these are the stories I love hearing. The ones that are just don't fit other narratives. So that's amazing to hear. I was gonna say, once you're in the cockpit of a Lancaster, you don't see who's up there anyway, because it's just on the way it's designed.
There's not a lot of room.
It's fantastic that you would have. Yeah, that's brilliant. And that's, sorry, this is completely aside, but I hear all the time about how they're so young in the Army, and I go, well, not really. So that really brings home to how young they are in the Air Forces.
Well, I think it also brings home actually what a dreadful experience those poor prisoners of war had endured. And, they're on their last lap between onward transmission back to Devon or Yorkshire or back to Canada or back to the US. And they see this youngster and, they just didn't need it, so to speak. Yeah, it says so many things, that story.
Yeah, there's probably a lot to go through in that one, but that's a fascinating one, and I'm glad I prompted that one out of you, because that's the stuff I like hearing. So if that's okay, we can kind of keep moving. So as a lot of us know, those in the the armed forces, really Second World War, a lot don't continue a military career after the fact. It's they were in for the duration, as we were talking about, doing their bit, and that's it, we're done. I wonder if you could speak to from what you can, of why your father stayed in the RAF. Was it just the love of flying, or is there more going on there?
It's simple as the love for flying. Dad could not believe his good fortune to be doing as his day job, his greatest passion. And indeed, he had a slight tendency to get a bit nerdy about some of the technological elements of it. But it was a great joy for him. And then, if you think about it, that transition from planes out of paper and glue to probably the most celebrated heavy bomber in the Second World War, and then the early stages of fast jets, when I was talking to a senior military Royal Air Force member the other day, and I said, well, my dad did X thousand hours. Is that a lot? And he said, Mark, that's not the point. In the early days of the jets, the number of people went up wasn't the same as the number of people who came back. So he saw all that transformation, and effectively he loved everything he flew, but I think he thought everything got better and faster and more maneuverable and that sort of thing. So he loved it, and flying came first. I think my mother was extremely patient, but the book is a love story about flying.
And that definitely comes through. I just wanted to see if there was something else, but I didn't think so. But gotta ask.
Well, the other dimension, Brad, is he was not shy about, in 1943, when he got his wings on his uniform, going back to his home in Torquay in southwest England, and showing them off. So he was pretty proud.
I mean, I don't blame him. And I mean, they're literally so shiny. It's literally will catch your eye. While for anyone, or even, well, I've never worn them, but you know, we get the angles. Anyway, I mean, that's just because that kind of leads to the next question. You know, going from, like you said, the heavy bombers, the Lancaster Bomber Command, which a lot of us are very familiar with, to, again, like you said, the dangers of flying those early jets, and we know all that. Did he, I mean, in the book a little bit, but talk about the transition and what was like? Was he, like you said, he loved the flying, but was there fear, trepidation? Because I mean, some of the stories I've heard of those early jets, it's not great.
Yeah. So I think there are some episodes which are frankly pretty alarming. So in the early days, and I think this gets us into the early 50s, he talks about a squadron of Hawker Hunters going out before the technology for landing in extreme bad weather conditions, particularly fog, was done and was sorted. And I think, a particularly press-on air officer commanding the airfield said, go up. And fog came in, and all 9 Hunters crash-landed.
Wow.
Dad talks about an early flight in a Javelin. This will be the late 50s, where his stick froze, i.e. the actual flying stick froze. So he had to fly in a straight line for 40 miles to land. And the engine stopped as he taxied. So there was some pretty iffy stuff on the way, but I think there was an element of thrill about it. And look, I think the thing that you asked me earlier about what struck me about his period in the Second World War. Dad was first taught in 1943 and only really became operational late 44, 45. The RAF, despite the pressure on numbers, was incredibly careful about making sure people were properly trained.
Right. Yes.
And I think Dad was very conscious of that. But during the book, there are numerous examples of, very sadly, people losing their lives in training accidents and that sort of thing. So, but actually, it's overwhelmed by the number of times he had fun.
I mean, that's kind of, I guess what I was getting at is I mean, the Lancaster, from what I've heard, never obviously flown one, but it was a joy to fly. But these are literally different in so many ways, and things like that. It's just hard for me to fathom going from the Lancaster, this 4-engine prop, to some of these fighters that you mentioned in the book. It's
he talks quite fluently about, with the progress in technology, when he first went on the Vampire, one of the early jets, he just talks about its speed, its maneuverability, how much easier it was in aerobatics, etc. And I think that just increased the fun quotient, quite frankly. When he first gets to the Lancaster, one of the things he notes is it actually had heating. Yes. So compared to the other things he was in, because I think when he was, in open-top biplanes in central UK in the middle of winter, it was probably a little too hearty. Yeah, those are not the most comfortable aircraft out there. This is I didn't think of this, but the other bombers, did he fly Halifax, Wellington, anything like that? So he, I don't think he flew a Halifax, but he actually trained his bombing training, having gone on a much smaller dual engine propeller airplane called an Oxford, which is a transport plane. He knew then he was destined for bombers. And he then transferred on to Wellingtons, but trained on Wellingtons, wasn't operational on Wellingtons. By then, the Wellington had been overtaken by the Lancaster, and he knew then he was going to go on to a Lancaster squadron one way or the other. So he had a lot. If you look at his logbook, there are just pages of flights on Wellingtons and Lancasters before he gets operational.
I figured as much. I wasn't sure about the Halifax, and I mean the Wellington obviously makes sense if you know the, again, kind of nerdy stuff of the production and all that stuff. There's a lot in there. This actually,
by the way, forgive me interrupting, Brad. The Halifax is important because the rather splendid memorial to Bomber Command in Green Park in central London, just opposite the Royal Air Force Club. The roof of it is made from the from the remains of the metal from Halifax.
Yep. Yeah, that was still talked about quite a bit because I'm doing tons of research on the memorials for the Air Force. So yeah, definitely come across that many times. But yeah, it's always great to hear that every time. Anyway, still kind of boggles my mind a little bit. One of those facts. But yeah, I was going to ask. Yes, sorry. So I don't know if this is kind of going back because we were just moving into the 50s there. But the one thing I did want to ask about is because again, doesn't come up, especially in the Canadian case, is the Berlin airlift. That's one. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that and his experience with that one.
So he was at the very early stages of the Berlin airlift. I think it was probably more formally the Berlin airlift after he participated in it. But he did a number of things. First of all, taking stuff into Berlin, but also taking people out. And so there are pictures in the book about the inside of the plane being full of women and children and that sort of thing. And I think that goes back to the point about Operation Manor and returning the POWs. I think he felt that there was a fairly important humanitarian element to some of the work that he did in the 50s and in the 60s, which when you pressed him on some of the operational stuff at the end of the Second World War, Dresden, Potsdam, that sort of thing, he didn't want to talk about it, but he did feel quite guilty about the impact on women and children, civilians, so to speak, other than a very well-established desire that the war needed to come to an end.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, that was what I was going to ask about. I want to transition after that because just again, the Berlin airlift is such a fascinating one for, again, the risk and the unknown, I guess, is kind of what I want.
Yeah, so he would get tracked by Soviet aircraft on the way and on the way back. Yeah. I don't get a sense he ever felt particularly concerned. Now, whether that was warranted or not, I don't know. But there are times in other parts of the book where it's very evident he was pretty anxious. But I don't get that sense on the early stages of the Berlin airlift. I don't know if that's because they hadn't found out then, but they did get tracked, and he thought that was pretty spooky.
I mean, yeah. I mean, well, you hear again. It's just my own experience in reading this stuff. Is you see the stuff on the ground, and it's cut off in that sense, right? Where pilots have no idea what's below them.
Yeah, absolutely. Going on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely, so that's just one that kind of stuck in my mind. But I'll have to go back because I didn't quite make it that far in the book. No. I ran out of time, but that's kind of where I stopped because busy. Anyway, so I'll have to go back. I'll have to go forward. Whatever it was, I have a bookmark somewhere. So moving into the kind of later into the Cold War period, because your father was stationed in quite a number of places. I kind of wonder if you could speak about that more generally and how he. I was going to say dealt, but that's not the right word. How he felt, how that being based in Cyprus and Germany as well, I believe.
Yeah. So let me just summarize it. He went after the Second World War finished, and you're right, he was rare in remaining in the Royal Air Force. He got posted to Egypt in a Lancaster squadron as Israel became independent in 1948. That was pretty intriguing. And then he got posted to Singapore in 1950, where he was a sort of aide-de-camp, the sort of chief of staff for the air officer commanding the Far East. So he did a number of ceremonial things, but sort of crazy things. He ended up meeting the King and Queen of Siam. He saw General MacArthur in Tokyo. And honestly, he saw the most beautiful parts of Asia. I'm talking about the Nicobar Islands, Trincomalee in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it is now. As I say, going around Japan in the early days. And he also spent a bit of time in Korea, where he left full of admiration for the United States Air Force pilots, because how brave they were. They frequently were flying the jets to the sort of maximum period of duration, taking immense risks. He came back, he actually met my mother, who worked for the security service for MI5 in Singapore. They married in St. Andrew's Cathedral in Singapore in 1952, returned. My sister was born, and then they got posted to RAF Aulhorn in Germany. And that was all part of the sort of Cold War preparation and that sort of thing. And that was when Dad was doing endless hours particularly in Meteors. And then we roll through to the early mid-60s, and then Dad got posted to Cyprus right at the beginning of the emerging Middle East crisis, 67, etc., 69, and indeed problems in Cyprus, quite apart from anything else. So he had both the sort of Middle East hat on, but also the broader Cold War context. And he was by then working in intelligence and flying less. The sort of operational flying was up to the early 60s.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's kind of, I guess we can get at the sense of what he wrote, but that intelligence work is, again, I didn't get that far, but how much detail is he going in about that? Because I mean, again, the love for flying, that's not that, right? Is he, I don't know, again, I'm not sure what the word is. I'm not upset, but not exactly what he wants to be doing.
Do you know, I can't, do you know, Brad, I can't really answer that question because the truth is the memoirs peter out in 1957.
Right, yeah.
Because he died. He hadn't told us he was writing the book. And of course, you've asked a question that I would love to know the answer on. I mean, he was spending an awful lot of time worrying about the Israeli-Egyptian dynamic. He spent some time in Libya, and that was the time that Gaddafi came into rule. And of course, there was the whole dynamic of the interaction of Allied forces with Soviet-related forces in the region. And so I fear I can't cast much light on that because he just stopped writing. And look, he's pretty open about the things that go on. So I think if I can manage it, I'll have to write a chapter 2 on his behalf.
I mean, it's just, how do I say this? He seems to follow the danger, or the danger follows him. I don't know. He seems to be going to so many hot spots. Yeah.
Do you know, somebody said to me, well, your dad's a bit like Forrest Gump. He just sort of seemed to turn up at all these major events. On the way, he did crazy things like dance with Rita Hayworth. I mean, how do you pull that off at the same time as seeing General MacArthur and meeting the King of Siam? Look, I think there was a hell of a lot going on. And that's the thing about the book, is not only was it a period of enormous transformational technological change, it was just a period of immense geopolitical turmoil, but also geopolitical uncertainty. And I say that nervously, as we know perhaps we're beginning to encounter a similar era now, where things are a little less certain than they were. And if they were certain, I think it's an awful lot to do with my mother and father's generation and helping secure that, and it may be unraveling now, but that's a philosophical point, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, try not to too much think about those parallels, especially now, but because it's just, again, another thing that kind of comes home, or hits home, sinks in, I guess, is that Cold War dynamic. I mean, particularly for someone of my age, don't remember the Cold War. I was born literally at the tail end of it, so I don't really remember, that sort of bipolar world, as it was called, but that's what we were told. But now getting to see these things, like especially your dad's work, it's not so simple as that. So it's a fascinating personal way of looking at this.
The way I sort of remember it is this permanent sense of the permanent threat from the USSR, but in between there are all sorts of pieces on the chessboard moving around. And Dad sort of saw it. He saw it in Korea. He saw elements of it later on in Vietnam, although he wasn't operational in Vietnam. But he certainly saw it in terms of the dynamics of what was going on in the Middle East and who was pulling which regime was pulling which levers, so to speak, or who the influencing parties were. In some respects, a simple way is to say there was one enemy, but I think it was much more multifaceted than that. Yeah,
and I think, again, not one of your objectives of this book, but it sets that out. I think when you just even do the list of his career, it's hard not to notice that, because he's hitting all these thoughts when things are bubbling up.
But it ended up being a fascinating career. So it's whilst it's a love story to flying, just the whole geopolitical dynamic and the military element towards that dynamic is absolutely fascinating. And I think he was very privileged, and I think he was aware he was privileged.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I think that comes through, and just his writing style. It's not sort of cocky. Not like that
Well,
in some sense.
that's very gracious of you to say that. What I'd say about him, he was a very warm and gentle man.
Mm.
He was very devoted to public service. If I can blow his trumpet a bit,
Of course,
he was extremely conscious of the contribution of others. So it's not about him, so to speak. There's lots of references to these poor guys who sorted the plane out when he came back, and how grateful he was, and as a result, he got on the plane feeling confident and that sort of thing. There are some very amusing stories in the Second World War about some relatively earthy exchanges of language when you didn't get back in time or in great shape, and how wonderful, particularly the women's Air Force were, and how tolerant and helpful and constructive they were. And on that note, he actually talks very positively about watching a Lancaster arrive in 1943 and a tiny woman getting out of it with no extra crew, and she was just delivering the aircraft. And he sort of makes the note, and he says, people talk about equality, the importance of equality now, and why not? He says. So
it's very much a.
He was a very decent human being. He was upset, for example, in Oklahoma about segregation still being in place and things like that. And I think he was very sensitive to that. Nice man.
Yeah,
I'm biased, Brad.
Well, yes, of course, but you're allowed to be biased on this channel because this isn't an academics, so I don't care. I mean, this is a good question from Norma, one of our longtime supporters and viewers. Was your mother able to shed any light on maybe some of the parts of the story that you didn't really, or had some holes or anything like that?
It's such a nice question, that, and I fear she wasn't, because Dad became ill in '73, and it's ridiculous he became ill. He had 3 heart attacks within 3 months in early '73, and these are things that, for you and me and everybody listening, we would get sorted out very quickly. But it beleaguered him in the 1970s. So Mum sort of became Dad's carer for the '70s, '80s until he faded away in 2001. And I'm sorry to tell you that she died 9 months later. She was devoted to him, devoted to the security service that she worked for her entire life, actually, but also to the Royal Air Force. And it's absolutely the right question, because, of course, I take 20 years to publish the memoirs, and it's just full of questions exactly like that. And I wish I'd done it, and I didn't.
Yeah, I mean, we all have those regrets in our lives about those we knew, but it's just I knew that answer, but I had to ask, especially because sometimes more details slip out. But I figured as much. I mean, your mother sounded like she had a fascinating career as well. So I mean, the two of them. I mean, that's what I wanted to ask you about next. Is, well, I mean, you're along for the ride, right? So your experiences and all this. I mean, I wanted to hear a little bit about Cyprus, if that's okay with you.
Well, look, I was in Cyprus from the age of 6.5 till about 12, and it was unmitigated joy from beginning to end. I mean, the weather was absolutely sublime. Cyprus hadn't been sort of invaded by tourism at that time, so it was just the most beautiful place. I think I probably swam every day for the entire time I was there. During that time, the Turkish-Greek dynamic got a little bit iffy, so I remember being escorted in my school uniform in Nicosia Airport by troops. So I went back to boarding school in the UK, but I had the most wonderful childhood. My parents were very active socially. They were utterly engaged in their work, and it was a very, very happy time. And I think my sister and I, we sort of knew at the time we were incredibly lucky. We had the most wonderful mongrel dog called Gus, which was short for disgusting, who sort of gave the appearance of being a Scottish Terrier, but sort of very independent spirited. I just had the most glorious time. And as a consequence of that, actually, I have the greatest affection and admiration for the Royal Air Force. You're talking to the black sheep of the family, because I went into investment banking, and that will probably terminate this podcast. But I'm the only member of the family who's going back a number of generations who's not served in the military or the security service.
Yeah, I mean, hey, he's talking about that in the book. The eyesight, I can't judge. I can't see either. I'm not wearing my glasses, but I can't see past my own desk half the time. So yeah, it's what can we do? Yeah, I mean, it's just, I know that the timing doesn't quite work for this question, but I still have to ask, like, what was your sense of your father's career? I know you talk about he was proud and trying to help, but I was just kind of wondering if you had any other kind of, I don't know, reflections on what you can remember from what he was doing while he was in the RAF and even afterwards as well.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I've ever been asked it. So this is slightly off the cuff. I feel his career was cut short by his illness.
Mm-hmm.
He was only 49, and
Right.
just a terribly vital man and alive. And he made the world a better place, and that beleaguered him. And now, at the grand old age of 65, I can reflect really on. He had so much to offer. He went on to work in the National Health Service, committed to public service. But he was not the same man. So I rue that. I regret that on his behalf. He would have, if he could. He stopped flying operationally sort of in the early 60s, and obviously in 1973, when he had the first of his heart attacks, he never flew again. And I think that broke his heart.
Yeah.
So sort of two dynamics of him: one, this utterly vital, wonderful, inspiring, active individual who's doing such exciting things. I fear I was pretty seduced by the idea of Dad being a jet pilot, and then really quite a beleaguered man for so long. But he remained positive all the way up to his final days. I greatly regret, and this is a family comment, is that he died when my three children were really quite young, and they would have loved him, and he would have been a great mentor to them. And I regret that a lot, because he would have been wonderful with them.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely understandable. I mean, my grandparents are of that similar age, so it's unluckily for me though, they were around until I was in my 20s, so I was lucky in that regard. But yeah, it's, again, I mean, Norma said we have regrets when talking about not getting the stories and everything like that, and especially now when those of that generation are really becoming quite old. And
well, look, I felt that I felt that last night. I mean, as I said earlier, it was technically it was his 100th birthday yesterday.
Yeah.
And I was very proud to talk about him and his life. And look, I struggled a bit when I said that this book is this book, which actually I've got here.
Yes.
Is, I hope, a tribute to him. But also I said I hope it was a small tribute in a small way to his generation. We owe them so much. And they were immensely brave at a crazily young age.
Yeah, I mean, that always stands out to me is the, again, that's just what you did mindset, which still, I mean, hard to wrap our heads around that coming after that war. But I mean, I guess we won't. Since you have the book there, I wasn't sure you had a copy within arm's reach, but you do. We're asking if there's a picture of your father.
Yeah, look, I've got a number. I mean,
I know you do. I just wasn't sure if the book was literally right there.
So I don't know if you can see this, Brad. I mean, that is Dad, aged 18, which is sort of crazy. And then there's a lovely photograph of him with his Lancaster crew in 1945. Right. And I don't know if this will come over on the screen very well, but you can see him in the centre standing with a big smile on his face. And he was 20 there, and I tell you, I think he looks about 16. So I understand the Canadian captain being a bit cautious.
I mean, it makes sense why he'd be a little cautious.
And I'm a lot. If you say I look like him, people say that. Well, I promise you, my ears don't stick out as much as his does.
Yeah. I want to ask. So the book. So it was released technically yesterday, right?
Formally released yesterday. It's available to purchase, I'm proud to say, from the 12th of June, and it's From Biplanes to Fast Jets.
Yes. So it'll be, is it getting a wide release in I guess, the English-speaking countries, as we were talking about earlier?
Yes, it is. Indeed, even my Belgian brother-in-law said he could buy it in Belgium. So I'm obviously going global.
Awesome. Well, there you go. Easier to do nowadays anyway. Yeah, that's great, Mark. Thanks again for sharing all those stories. Sorry, just this comment is funny. He was a tall man, so getting into that cockpit of a Lancaster could not have been easy.
Well, look, there's a subject of dispute in the family because I think I'm 6'2". I'm absolutely certain Dad was 6'1.5", but there wasn't a lot of room. And I tell you, when I sat in the front of a Lancaster, I smacked my head around a fair bit, so it wasn't a lot of room.
Yeah, I mean, him coming. I mean, especially now. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, about the height. That story of him moving around the outside and then getting in.
Yeah,
couldn't have been easy. And then now thinking about those Cold War jets, and I've sat in the cockpit of some of them, and the windshield, the windshield comes here on my head.
Very tight. So, not a lot of room for maneuver.
Yeah, he must have been squished in there real good. But yeah, I don't think we have any other questions. Looks like a lot of the people watching now and hopefully afterwards are excited to get their hands on the book, which will be in
thank you.
A couple of weeks, 2 weeks. Yeah, having trouble keep track of the calendar at this moment. But yeah, so other than that, everyone, thanks for watching. Thank you so much, Mark, for
thank you. It's been a great pleasure to talk about something I'm devoted to.
Well, yeah, and actually that leads me to one final question, if you don't mind. Do you plan on maybe taking it past that time period when you just had the memoir and digging more into, and maybe both your parents and
well, I tell you, the former chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Mike Wigston, has very kindly written an introduction to this book, and he said to me that actually in Kew Gardens in the archives, every month, every squadron was required to write reports on what had happened. Yep. And, I must say, had I known that in advance, I would have done that. So I think, you might see me disappearing into Kew for a while to get a bit more colour. I fear with Mum, I won't be able to find out very much about her. So there we are.
Well, hey, you'd be surprised what you can find. That's why I asked that, is because I know, because I'm in the queue a bunch. I know what's in there.
Well, perhaps I'll have a go.
And you should. It's a great place to research anyway. So other than that, yeah, thanks again, Mark. Again, really appreciate having this chat with you directly and getting to hear about your father directly from you, having my digital copy of the book and getting to look through. And the photos are great. I will say that. So if anyone can get their hands on the book, I highly suggest it. So other than that, everyone have a good rest of your, Thursday? And,
Thursday, yeah.
We'll see everybody next time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Brad. Thank you for taking the time.
Of course, pleasure's all mine. Thanks again, Mark. And